This is the Enragés, a show where we take a deeper dive into written works published at the Center for a Stateless Society. Join us as we give voice to the ideas challenging the vain phantoms that haunt our social reality and stand in the way of total liberation. For more information, visit c4ss.org. And to support this show or any of the other projects happening at the Center, please visit patreon.com/c4ss.org. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to the Enragés. I'm your host, Joel Williamson, and joining me today is Sheldon Richman to discuss Zionism, the state of Israel, and whether or not there's hope for Palestinian freedom. Sheldon Richman is a writer, editor, pipe smoker, free thinker, libertarian market anarchist, grouser, flosser, and author of 6 books, including What Social Animals Owe to Each Other, Coming to Palestine, America's Counter-Revolution, The Constitution Revisited, Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families, and Tethered Citizen, Time to Repeal the Welfare State. Most of Sheldon's work can be found at sheldonrichman.com. The questions you're about to hear in this episode are pulled from a variety of articles that Sheldon has written for the Center, including The U.S. Rewards Bad Behavior, Rethinking the U.S.-Israeli Relationship, Israel's War on Gaza, the context, and finally, No Compensation to Israel for Iran Deal. Big thanks to everyone who reached out and suggested questions and direction for this interview. It's an absolute honor to have on such a prolific writer and thinker who has been instrumental in shaping modern American libertarianism, left libertarianism, and market anarchism. Sheldon Richman, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Joel, for inviting me. I'm pleased to be with you.
Flattered to have you on. You've been, like I said in your intro, very instrumental in shaping libertarianism, left libertarianism, and it's an honor to have you here. So,
very good. Thank you.
I want to just jump right into this thing. So, you've been interviewed on this topic a lot. Hopefully, we can avoid some of the questions that you've been asked in the past with other interviews regarding Zionism, Israel, and Palestine. But in other interviews, you've mentioned that you were brought up in a Philadelphian Jewish neighborhood within a religiously conservative Jewish family and attended Hebrew school for 3 days a week where, as you noted elsewhere, your education about Israel began, leading you to become a staunch supporter of Zionism. I know that you're no longer religious, but in your opinion, how is it that the messianic emphasis on the, quote, world to come within Judaism became intertwined with the utopian political project of Israeli statehood?
Well, that's a big question. I'm not sure I'm the most qualified person to answer it, but I can maybe shed a little bit of light on it. I think it's important to realize that the Zionist movement that begins, and that's the idea that the Jewish people, we can talk more about what that concept means, but the Jewish people ought to reclaim the state they had in ancient times for a host of reasons, and we can go through some of the reasons too. But it's important to understand that this movement, which becomes formalized in the late 19th century, we're talking about pretty late in the 1890s. There are precursors to Theodor Herzl, but he's, of course, considered the father, the founder of the modern Zionist movement and the World Organization, and what really got the ball rolling. That was a secular movement. That was Herzl, and then the people who eventually became a lot of the early pioneers, and then the ones who actually became constituted the first kind of ruling elite of the Jewish settlement there, and then what became formally the state in the late 1940s, was a secular movement. They were not religious. They were conceiving the Jewish people as not in religious terms, but in basically ethnic, genetic terms. I think this kind of a change in what constituted the Jewish people upset most Jews in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. It was a minority movement, Zionism. There was huge opposition from the most orthodox among Jews around the world and in the United States, and also the Reform movement, which is a fairly new movement, with most of the activity being in the U.S., but also Germany and further west. So it was Central and Eastern European Jews, secularists tend to be leftists in a sense. They were socialists, not necessarily Herzl in that latter case, but who tried to get the movement rolling and who eventually succeeded. But meanwhile, people who saw Judaism more as a religion rather than as a peoplehood opposed Zionism for quite a long time. When the Reform movement adopts a formal declaration in the United States in the 1880s, and this is 1885, so it's before the Herzl organization even gets started. They say we are a religious community. We do not seek a state. That was from ancient times. That's history. That was for that time and place. We're a universal religion. We hope to bring it to the world, and we no longer see ourselves in exile. They also proclaimed basically their love of the United States because of its secular nature, the constitutional prohibition against the religious test. The government was not allowed to favor a religion, for First Amendment, of course. You couldn't establish a religion. And so it took a long time, and a lot of it had to do, of course, with the troubles that the Jews suffered in Europe, culminating, of course, with the Nazis, that it took a long time before most Jews then moved in the Zionist direction to some extent or another.
Right. And then, of course, then Reform changed their mind at some point and was like, hey, actually, we do support the modern state of Israel. It seems like everyone kind of got on board at some point eventually.
Right. Now the minority view is that there should not be a Jewish state. There's still a reform organization in the U.S. that began in the late 1940s called the American Council for Judaism, which still puts out a monthly newsletter and puts on programs, I guess. And they have a good writer and activist who's a conservative named Alan Brownfeld, who's been at this a very long time. This was an organization founded by Rabbi Elmer, helped be founded, and was executive director for quite a few years, Rabbi Elmer Berger. You can find books of his that are a devastating case against the idea of a Jewish state. And it was on two counts. Number one, they would point out that Palestine was not, and never was, a land without a people. And so on the one hand, there were people there, and actually for a long time, there were Jews there living, more or less peacefully side by side with, in other words, there were Palestinian Jews, I think they were even called that, along with Palestinian Arabs, Muslims, Christians, a lot of them Christians, and I'm sure some secular, because Jews had gone there for over many years, but not to form a state. Some wanted to just be, these were the more Orthodox who wanted to be there, eventually when the Messiah comes, and the dead would be raised. I mean, I've heard, kind of wisecracks about, they thought maybe if they were closer to Jerusalem or in Jerusalem, they would be one of the first to be resurrected. So the Orthodox didn't like Zionism at first, and again, that's changed over the years, but they didn't like it because they didn't like the people who were running the Zionist movement. They thought they were frauds. They thought they were counterfeit. They thought they were heretics, and that they eventually elevated the state to where the Torah was supposed to be, right? The Torah, which is the 5 books and 5 books of Moses, and then the other books, Psalms and Judges and Kings and the prophets. That was supposed to be the center, and obeying God's 613 commandments. This is according to the Orthodox, and the idea of making a state of this was anathema to them. They didn't like that at all. So you had the extremes, the Reform and the Orthodox, both condemning Zionism. And when Herzl announced the first international congress of this new Zionist movement, it was going to be in Germany. Something like 85 rabbis in Germany protested that the meeting shouldn't be allowed to be held. I think they protested to the government. And so it ended up being in Basel, Switzerland, because the German Jews, who tended to be much more reformed, Moses Mendelssohn was kind of their.
They're more German than German.
Well, and they were very German too, which of course has relevance to the horror of the Nazi period. But they were very much inspired. The person considered the first reformed Jew, namely Moses Mendelssohn, back from the 18th century. But he set the tone for how you could be a good citizen of the country you were living in, and be a Jew at home. In other words, Jewishness was not your essence; it was your religion. But you were a citizen of a country, and and that's what the Reform believed. They believe American Jews are Americans who are Jewish. They're not Jews first, and and I think this has a logic to it. Somebody writing about this today, who's an Israeli named Shlomo Sand, is very good on stuff like this, and I could name some of his books. But their point was, look, there are Jews of many different countries, many different cultures, many different languages. Most Jews don't speak Hebrew. Most Jews don't speak Yiddish. Yiddish is from Eastern Europe. That's a very particular thing. I mean, a lot of Americans may think when they think Jewish, they think of Yiddish culture and foods. But a Yemeni Jew wouldn't understand Yiddish. And probably doesn't eat those foods. Now, in this era of world culture, because of the internet and mass media, of course, everybody eats bagels all over the world. So it's lost some of that distinction. But if you go back a few decades, those were particular. And the Jews who came from Spain or who came from the Arab countries, the so-called Sephardim, or the Mizrahi, which were the Arab Jews. There were Iraqi Jews, there were Jews all over the Middle East who had brought up and they were culturally Arab. They wouldn't have gotten Yiddish theater. The humor was different. The culture was different. So they would say, it's a religious community, but that's all it is. What else do we have in common? And Sand goes on so far as to point out he doesn't understand what the concept of secular Jew means. If you're an atheist but claiming to be a Jew, Sand asks, what do secular Jews around the world have in common? And how can someone who's not Jewish, who wasn't born Jewish, doesn't have a Jewish mother, how does that person become a secular Jew? Which is a very good question.
Maybe you can identify with it culturally, but not actually believe sort of literally in Scripture.
But that's the point. As I pointed out, there's not a single culture.
Not a single, but there's aspects of Judaism that has cultures like Yiddish. So
when you're culturally Yiddish, you're not culturally Jewish, because a Yemeni Jew wouldn't know what you're doing.
Sure. Okay, that's fair.
So anyway, yeah, it's a rabbit hole you can go down. But I think it's a very good question. His concern was, he doesn't want to call himself a secular Jew. He's an atheist, I take it, and he's not a religious Jew. He doesn't want to be called a Jew because he doesn't like the essentialism, right? I'm a human being. We're all human beings. Now we can adopt doctrines and religious ideas and religious practices, and we can become what we want. But he doesn't like this. First of all, he's very uncomfortable with this idea that in a sense, once a Jew, always a Jew, because it's a biological thing. Because who's that sound like from the 30s? That didn't, in the 30s, when the Nazis and anti-Semites even before the Nazis were saying things like that, there were Jews objecting to that. Now, today, there's research going on in Israel to show there's a Jewish gene, there's Jewish DNA. Now, if you espouse that view in the 30s, you were an anti-Semite. If you oppose that view today, some people will call you an anti-Semite. So something's changed.
All right. So let's move on a little bit. I have way too many questions for you here.
Oh, sure,
and
sure.
This is all very interesting. And we could, do an entire podcast on any of the things that we talked about to this point. But, if you walk in during the middle of a movie, it'd be difficult to understand the plot. And even more difficult to be a credible reviewer of said movie. I've actually heard you say this in a previous interview before.
Yeah.
If we're concerned with truth, justice, and peace, at what point in history is it most appropriate to begin an investigation into the so-called Israeli-Palestine conflict, and when did this tragic film actually begin?
That's a great question. That's like the big question, and there's not going to be a perfect answer to that. And of course, it doesn't only apply in the Middle East, right? You have old grievances that go back hundreds of years, longer than that. And so one thing we can say for sure is that we cannot put genies back in bottles and toothpaste back in tubes. We can't undo the injustice of history. If you try, you're going to create a whole new set of injustices. So in other words, where does it end? That's a real issue. I think that's a moral milestone. We have to recognize that. And that has to inject realism into conversations. Now, that doesn't mean we just accept everything as is, and even injustices that were relatively recent, and say, let's everybody drop your complaints and move on from there. I mean, we have courts where, right, if your property is stolen, you can try to recover it, and the perpetrator can't say, well, that was a week ago. Come on, move on. I mean, so, in other words, we have to find some balance, and there's not an algorithm to do it. So what the Zionist movement was doing was saying, is as if they came to the door of Palestine, knocked on the door, and people opened it, and they said, we're back. We used to live here 2,000 years ago. We got kicked out, and I want to say something about that in a minute historically, but we got kicked out in 70 Common Era by the Romans, and now we're back. On the face of it, I think everybody should recognize that that's kind of ridiculous. First of all, that's not the only place that could happen. People got kicked out of lands back then and in the Middle Ages and other times up till the current moment. And how can we possibly right all of that? It would be impossible, and a lot of injustice would have to occur, right? First of all, the original victims and the original perpetrators are long dead. I mean, long dead in the case of the Zionist claim, because we're talking about the year 70. I'll just say as a side note that one of the things Sand brings to light, and he's not discovering this for the first time, but he's presenting it because people aren't taught this, is that there was no expulsion of the Judeans from Judea in the year 70 by the Romans. The Romans didn't do that. There are no records about it. They might have taken away some of the elite, because don't forget there was a rebellion by the Judeans against the Romans. And so they took away the people they thought were troublemakers, but they left the population. So there never was an exile. There wasn't an expulsion and an exile. So I'll just leave it that. Like you said, we could talk all day about that one. But there are no books about exile. Sand looked when he was investigating his book, The Invention of the Jewish People, which is a very good book. I highly recommend it. And he couldn't find any books. And he asked academics at the University of Tel Aviv, where he taught the historians of Jewish history, and said, where are the books on I figured there'd be walls of books on the exile. Where are they? And they said, well, it wasn't exactly an exile. That's what he was told. You can find his lectures on YouTube. So that should inform us. Now, I don't believe that's critical, because if there was an exile, it wouldn't change the story about whether 2,000 years later you can say, my ancestors used to live on this land, so get out. I think that would be illegitimate even if there had been an exile. So what do we do? We do know that beginning in the, let's say, early 20th century, land purchases were made. Some of the land purchases I would regard as entirely legitimate and consistent with sort of Lockean principles of land acquisition. So some land was sold by individuals to some Jews who wanted to settle there. But that ends up being only about 7% of the whole of Palestine by the time the state comes into existence, or the time the UN recommends it in 1947. But a lot of land was acquired not by methods I would regard as not legitimate, not Lockean. I tend to be a Lockean on land, because they were bought from absentee feudal landlords, people who were living in Beirut, who were very wealthy, who nominally under the Ottoman Empire, which ruled for 400 years this region until they lost World War I, along with the Germans and Austrians to the Allies. They bought huge tracts from these absentee landlords. They were feudal landlords, and then they kicked the people off who had been working the land. I regard those as Lockean owners who've been working the land along with their families before them for 1,000 years or more, and they got kicked off, which created a lot of resentment. So a lot of the resentment of Jewish settlement beginning in this Herzl period, and then through the 20s and into the 30s. A lot of the resentment, and we could say most of the resentment, was not, I don't think, shouldn't be considered anti-Semitism. If someone takes your land from you, and that person happens to be Jewish, and you get mad at that person, for taking the land, it's ridiculous to say you're an anti-Semite for being mad. Presumably be mad at anybody taking his land from him. And so I think a lot of what the history is misunderstood because they don't understand that people were being dispossessed even then. And then when you get a Declaration of Independence by the Zionists after the UN recommended, and I stress they recommended, the UN had no power to partition Palestine. There's nothing in the bylaws about the UN being able to partition any land anywhere. So they recommended it to the Security Council. Security Council never did anything. And then so about a year later, the Israeli leaders, well, they would soon become Israel, said, we're independent. And they claimed they didn't like the partition because they didn't think it was enough of the land. They were getting more than half, even though they owned 7%. And that's even with the illegitimate acquisitions. So it's all a jumble and it's all a mess. I'll stop here because I'll let you ask more specific questions. I could keep talking, but I think it'll be more directed if I stop at this point. Let you direct it a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and thank you for that thoughtful answer too.
Yeah.
So, what's the difference between Jewish people seeking refuge in Palestine and Afghani people seeking refuge in America?
Yeah, a fair question. Here's the quick difference in a nutshell. The Afghans who are coming here and who want to come here aren't saying, we want half of the United States to set up an Afghan state or a Muslim state. I mean, Afghan is different from Jewish, right? Jewish is a religious category, at least in my view, and Afghan is a national or ethnic category, although I guess they're Persian by descent, I think, if I have that right. But anyway, it's not religious, right? They're Muslim. So it was very clear that even though they didn't openly talk about it, it was clear the Palestinian Arabs understood, certainly the intelligentsia among them. And by the way, it wasn't like some undeveloped backwater place with a few people. People had lived there continuously. There were newspapers, there were libraries, there were schools. I'm not saying it was a wealthy place, of course. They didn't have full free markets, but it was a place where trade occurred. I mean, it was somewhat vibrant a place. It wasn't just some empty desert. So the Zionist movement didn't just seek a place for refuge from all the troubles in Europe. I'm talking now. Let's talk pre-Nazi first, or the earlier in the movement, the 1900s and then the 1920s, before the 30s. They weren't just seeking, and they might well have gotten, because some Arab intellectuals were open to this, of having Jews who wanted to escape from the Tsar and the Poles and the others that who were perpetrating pogroms and other horrors, not as bad as the Nazis would be, but certainly bad. And also the legal disabilities. You couldn't own land, you couldn't go into certain professions. The movement wasn't just seeking a refuge. They wanted a Jewish state. And that was clear in the international congresses they were holding. It was clear from rhetoric. Now, in 1917, when the British government issues the Balfour Declaration, which stated that His Majesty's government looks with favor upon the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, the Zionists who helped draft that in England, Chaim Weizmann and the others, who worked with Balfour and other British diplomats to get that written, were very artful in the language, because certainly the leading Zionists had a state in mind, possibly in all of Palestine. Now, I'm sure they differed person to person. Some were more pragmatic, some were more dogmatic. Let's take what we can get. Others would say, let's not settle. What happens in a movement with an objective. There's going to be compromise. So it doesn't sound like a formal state in according to the language of the Balfour Declaration. But again, the rhetoric, the speeches at these various international meetings, which gets out, and it's a buzz. It's a buzz around the Middle East, too, that the people who are throwing us off land want to come in and form a state. We would now be part of what's being called a Jewish state. That would cause resentment you can have resentment without anti-Semitism. That's my point. I hope that answered your question. They weren't just looking to emigrate there for some kind of refugee status where they'd be safe from the Europeans. They wanted to formalize it as a political movement. It was a political movement, which is very different from what the Afghans or any immigrants are doing here. No immigrants are coming here to set up their own state.
So Israel isn't very liberal. but still relatively more liberal than its neighbors. Is this a good enough justification to support Zionism or the modern state of Israel?
No, and some libertarians do that. I know the people among the Ayn Rand crowd take that position, and I think they take a lead from Rand herself in the comment she made, I think in '73 at a Q&A of a speech where she announced she had sent some money to Israel when the '73 war started. They were enlightened people against the savages, as she put it, which is ignorant, uneducated. I don't think she really cared about the facts there. I think she was non-thinking on her feet. Let's put it that way. But that's carried on by certainly the Ayn Rand Institute, the various people there, and I know of libertarians who certainly seem to take that position. It's certainly that there's a good deal of private property. There's more than there used to be. The founding Labor Party, which were the Eastern Europeans, secular, were socialists. They set up the kibbutz movement, and the industry and labor were extensions of the state. The Histadrut, which was the labor movement, was basically an arm of the state. So it was all state involvement. That changed later when the conservatives finally come in the late '70s. And so there you get more of the idea of free enterprise. I mean, there could be small shops, smaller shops and forms of commerce. So it wasn't, state didn't dominate everything. But then later with the Conservative Party, which was more free enterprise oriented, you get more of that. And I think a lot of land was privatized. But it's important to realize that most of the land is still under the ultimate control of the government, and people can get very long-term leases, which is then kind of treated as private property. But it's not open to Arabs. Most of the land is not available to the Palestinian Arabs because this is land that's reclaimed for the Jewish people, to use the language that's used. This was redeemed, right? This was Jewish land that had to be removed from the hands of non-Jews and put back into. And this is again what the Reform objected to, and it's what the early Orthodox also objected to. I mean, look, they have a more or less independent judiciary. To get back to the main point of your question, yes, it's much more, and it's wealthier for these reasons, right? It's much more Western in that way. But don't forget, it was Europeans who basically settled it, and they were more oriented toward Western values, certainly in the area of civil liberties, presumption of innocence, those kinds of things. And they have elections. It's a parliamentary system, but there are lots of disabilities, of course, legal disabilities on the Arabs. And so they are at best second-class citizens, and you might argue they were third-class citizens. The non-European Jews were for a long time treated as second-class citizens. The ones that came from the Morocco and the other Arab countries, and ultimately and from Spain before that, they were kept out of power for a very long time, and they were looked down as culturally Arab. They were inferior and backward. They started a party called the Black Panther Party back in the 80s, I think, or the 70s, because they were fed up with being, maybe it was earlier than that, maybe it was even in the 50s. They were fed up with the second-class citizenship. Now, again, that's changed over the years.
That's interesting. I didn't know the Black Panther Party part. So, someone might say, okay, Sheldon, all this might be true, but I mean, at the end of the day, wouldn't it just be simply reckless to call for an end to the modern state of Israel? I mean, wouldn't Jewish people be less safe without a nation state?
Well, I don't offer a particular solution because I really think people there are going to have to figure it out. One thing Shlomo Sand says is, I agree with him. You can't wipe out the last 70 years, right? There is an Israeli society. I'm kind of using his words now, but I agree with him. And there's an Israeli state in the sense of it's not, and he wants to stress, it's not a Jewish state. It's an Israeli state. It's not a theocracy. You don't have to go to synagogue. You don't have to keep kosher. Now, there are since the religious parties do have some power because they need to be kept in coalitions. Mm-hmm. All the governments have been coalition governments. They've had to give some things to the religious parties. And from the very beginning, the religious parties, and this was not for coalition purposes, but just for identity purposes, the religious parties were in charge, in other words, the ultra-Orthodox were in charge of marriage and divorce. There's no secular marriage. There's no intermarriage.
Mm-hmm.
There's no there's no secular divorce. This is all synagogue controlled. There's no full separation of synagogue and state. But Sand wants to say, nevertheless, for 70 years, what has emerged is a distinct Israeli culture. He doesn't want to call it Jewish culture, and I think he's right. There's modern Hebrew. Hebrew through the Zionist movement was kind of updated and vocabulary added because they weren't, they didn't make Yiddish the language of Israel.
They outlawed Yiddish in many ways.
They made modern, because they thought the Orthodox, and even Herzl talked about the Orthodox as, die off already. You're the old. We're going to set up with the new Jew, the land of the new Jew, the farmer and the strong and the soldier. And then they would, some of them actually mocked the ones that wore the old garb, the long coats and the broad hats. And I'm not Orthodox. My grandfather was Orthodox, but not Orthodox. He wasn't the extreme Orthodox. He didn't wear all that stuff, and there's so many strains of Orthodoxy.
Is modern Orthodox
in the 20th century? There's modern, there's a whole bunch. I mean, Israel Kirzner, the great Austrian economist, is a form of Orthodox Jew, but he doesn't have the long hair, or he's got a very short beard. He's got a long beard. You can't really tell. It's changed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So. We cannot ignore what happened beginning in the 30s with the Nazis. If we thought things were bad in Europe for Jews up until 1933, we ain't seen nothing yet. I mean, it's one of the great horrors of world history, of human history. I mean, a terrible, terrible thing. And before that happened, of course, there was debate among Jews about whether you should leave Europe or stay and try to make Europe a better place. And you had more liberal types who were trying to convince their fellows that you could change the atmosphere and make it more liberal. Others wanted to come to the United States. I mean, they were aware of what the conservative Jews were doing in the U.S. And the conservative Jews, as I mentioned earlier, were bragging about. I mean, in the founding of a synagogue in South Carolina, I believe in Charleston, South Carolina, in the 19th century, the rabbi was claiming, This land is our Zion. This city is our Jerusalem. In other words, the exile. This is where we want to be. And so there was immigration, Jewish immigration from Europe to the United States. Unfortunately, 1924, the U.S. clamped down on immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And they made it a fraction. They invented the quote is a fraction of what it was in 1890s. In other words, it went back to the 1890 numbers, which is obviously going against the Italians and Greeks too, because it was Southern, not just Eastern Europe, but Southern Europe. They made the quote as a fraction of what the numbers were from 1890, not from 1924. So you can see how they shrunk it. Calvin Coolidge signed this saying, America should be for Americans, crap like that. And Sanders argued that maybe there wouldn't have been a Holocaust if that bill had never been passed, on the grounds that many fewer people would have been killed because people would have come here. But the gates were shut. And everybody knows the famous story about during the New Deal, right? During the 30s, Roosevelt's in power when the St. Louis, that ship comes to, near Miami, right? Bringing Jews from Germany. And they're in sight of the pier, the dock, and it's turned away because of the quotas. I mean, this is outrageous. I mean, this will break your heart. You can find stuff on YouTube about this. You can find film about this. I mean, it'll absolutely break your heart. Now, one of the negative things that I think the opponents of Zionism are pointing this out, and it gets back to this essentialism I was mentioning, the movement to get a state in Israel, even before the Nazis, were using rhetoric about Jews, and Herzl was doing some of this even as early as that, which ended up being adopted by anti-Semites. It kind of affirmed what the anti-Semites were saying. Herzl and others would say, "Look, we agree with you, you rulers of Europe. We are aliens here. We will always be strangers here." In some cases, they said, "We'll always be parasites. So give us a state." They appealed to the Turks. Before World War I, when the Turks were still in charge, they appealed to the British, they appealed to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to the Germans. They were looking to anybody. to get a state. And they said terrible things like, we agree, we don't belong here. We only belong there in Palestine. Originally, Herzl was willing to go anywhere, right? He would go to, I don't know, Zimbabwe or Argentina, but people around him said, no, it's got to be Palestine. We'll never get anywhere if it doesn't have to be Palestine. So that idea got dropped. But a lot of people warned that this rhetoric about how the Jew it's an essential category, and you're always going to be an alien in Europe, did great damage. And you can find books that have been written, just in the last 30, 40 years. But Lenny Brenner is a guy who's written Zionism in the Age of Dictators is a book you can find online, the text online, worth looking at, because he talks about the appeal that was made to dictators and the rhetoric which was so damaging. Now, it doesn't mean the Nazis wouldn't have come to power. So you have a terrible thing. So let's now get past the Nazis. You now have a bunch of displaced people, a lot of displaced people after the death of millions of people. And so what happens to them? And, I don't have some easy answer to that. One person said, well, give them a section of Germany. It was Germany certainly German rulers that committed the crimes. But here's, one thing I think we need to say. And again, I'm not going to present a solution. It's not ultimately up to me. I mean, what I would like, of course, is a completely classically liberal, market, anarchist, secular society. But that's not on the menu, right? I'm not the one. No one's asking me what do I have there. But one thing I think is fair to say, to show you how the injustice runs in two directions. The Palestinians were not running Germany. The Palestinians didn't run concentration camps, death camps, gas chambers. And yet what it looks like is that after the war, the leaders of Europe, with the U.S. cooperating and others, Canada, the others cooperating, said, we need to assuage our guilt for what happened to the Jews because we didn't do anything or let great numbers in when they might have escaped. We're going to lessen our guilt by imposing on the Palestinians. Well, there's something wrong with that. And the Zionist movement was happy to take up the offer by the Western governments. When the partition recommendation comes before the General Assembly, after a couple of different commissions had studied this, and they ignored the Palestinians. They didn't count. The Arabs didn't count either. The Arab governments didn't count. And they didn't like the partition. They rejected it because somebody was coming to them and saying, look, we're going to take more than half your land and give it to people they thought were basically new arrivals, and they're going to get half the land. So the Palestinians who stay there are now going to be under a new state of people they don't know, and or they have to leave, uproot themselves. But what happened was, of course, with the pressure on the Palestinians and then the outright war that goes on, Palestinians are driven off, right? 750,000 or so Palestinians are driven out of the part of the partition recommendation that was supposed to go to the Zionist movement and become the new state. And after the war, the Israelis actually end up with about 78%. So yes, if you only look at the problem of the displaced Jews after World War II, and it's a heartbreaking thing, something all people of good faith would want to help find some solution to that. And I wasn't alive then. It was a few years before I was going to be born. It can't have been the right answer to say, well, the Palestinians rank lower, they don't matter, and so we don't need to consult them. I mean, Balfour even says, look, we made promises to the Arabs that we never had any intention of keeping. I mean, they told the Arab governments during the Arab leaders during World War I, if you rebel against your Turkish overlords, and the Turks might have been Muslims, right, but they weren't Arabs, so they felt like they were a foreign power over them. They wanted independence. They said, we'll give you independence after the war if you give the Turks hell during the war and help us win, right? Because you'll be like a rear action guard. You'll distract the Turks, and they won't be able to help Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire against the Allies. And then they screwed them. They screwed them at the Treaty of Versailles, and they kept they kept Palestine as a what they call it, a mandatory, a mandate, which was like basically a colony, and then they oversaw Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, stuff like that. So I hope I answered your question. I probably drifted again, but there's so many elements in this.
Yeah.
And I agree with the sentiment that underlies all your questions. A terrible, an unspeakable tragedy occurred in Europe. It had been for a long time, and then it just only got worse with the Nazis. Mm-hmm. And something could have been done, but the Western governments weren't very interested, right? Were they? They didn't lift the quotas.
Right.
Instead, they said, let the Palestinians suffer. That's how we'll feel better. Let the Palestinians suffer. The Palestinians did not matter.
Right.
And to this day, they have a very hard time of it. The people in Gaza are in an open-air prison.
Yeah.
And every couple of years, the Israelis attack them with airstrikes and, overwhelming force. They have a few rockets. Some people have called them glorified fireworks. They may be a little more destructive than that. But with Iron Dome, which the U.S. funds, that's even been minimized. But a lot of times they've attacked a town. The town that they attack are where some of those refugees or their parents used to live. Mm-hmm. But they got driven out. Mm-hmm. During what's known as in Arabic as the Nakba, right? The catastrophe that occurred in 1947-48, when 750,000 people were driven out, mm-hmm. Sometimes through outright massacres. So Palestinians have also suffered a terrible tragedy, and they had nothing to do with the Nazis.
Right.
It's not just, we need a refuge. This is Jewish land. You do not have the right to be on it. It's Jewish. And I think you can make strong objections to that. And I think Sand has voiced them very well in his 3 books on this. And again, the remaining reform also agree. And they don't like the idea that there's a Jewish land. And they think the Jewish state has become a form of idolatry. Right? God, again, like I said earlier, God and the commandments are not at the center of things anymore. It's the land. When I went to Hebrew school, you mentioned this, the Israeli flag was up there at the front of the classroom, and at the synagogue, and it's probably true of every synagogue today, except for maybe some holdouts, the Jewish national flag. The Israeli national flag. It wasn't a Jewish flag.
Right.
The Israeli flag, the star and the two blue stripes, stands with the American flag. And the reformists pointed out, there's a huge anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist tradition. I really need to stress that. And some of them are religious. Some of them might consider themselves secular Jews. But the point is they were anti-Zionist. People generally don't know about that. They think, all anti-Zionists must be non-Jews and probably even anti-Semites.
Yeah,
true. There's a huge literature, but they just objected to this idea that there should be a state.
Mm-hmm. So it's easy for me, at least, to wrap my head around emotionally the impetus behind wanting to flee in some ways, right? The pogroms and everything. Like it's understandable, like why you would want to just get away and have like a safe haven in some ways. Mm. And I guess it's possible to imagine that this project could have gone in a bunch of different directions. I mean, you even see some modern secular left-wing Zionist movements who don't call for statehood necessarily, but, like a kibbutz sort of situation. And I don't know how practical that is to reform the modern state of Israel into that. Like you were saying, we can't, have our market anarchist utopia. I doubt that's practical either.
Right. And the kibbutz movement faded because I think people didn't find it attractive. New arrivals would go in the kibbutz to learn Hebrew and to kind of get in the swing of things. And it was a way, if you were coming to Israel to move and didn't have a lot of money, okay, that was maybe a good place to just kind of get oriented and get your feet on the ground. But people then left. The younger people left. It wasn't something most people didn't want to live on a collective farm. I mean, I don't want to live on a collective farm. I would imagine most people don't. So you might find some, but it's a shell of what it used to be. And maybe it doesn't get the same support, the state support that it used to get. I'm sure a lot of state support. But I mean, just to give you an idea of the potential that might have been squandered, it's an undeniable fact that Jews over the centuries had a much easier time in the Arab world and the Muslim-controlled world than in Europe. I mean, it's no contest. In Spain, when the Muslims took over Spain, long ago, there were Jews there, and it wasn't until 1492 that the Jews get kicked out or forced to convert to Christianity. And it was the 15th century. But why were they there? Why were they there to be kicked out? Because the Muslims didn't kick them out. Now, it doesn't mean everything was perfect. There was some discrimination against Jews, but Cordoba on that peninsula, when it was ruled by Muslims, was a thriving multicultural city with a great deal of tolerance and liberality, and it was a great center for intellectual achievements and commerce. But I'm not saying every Muslim ruler, however local, was nice to the people who weren't Muslims, but by and large, people were not forced to convert. And so, if there had been a non-state effort, non-political effort to find a refuge around the Middle East, that might have worked much better, because again, it was always much more hospitable to Jews than Europe had been. I mean, Europe was terrible for a very long time.
Right.
And so that was not really tried. I mean, there were people, they were known as cultural Zionists. Martin Buber is, I think, often given as an example, the philosopher of this, who feared a statehood movement and wanted to make a different kind of overture to the Arabs in Palestine and beyond, in the larger area. But that they weren't listened to. The idea was, no, it has to be a state. It's got to be a state.
Right.
And that looks like a big mistake, because, our Jews, you won't find a lot of pro-Israel people who believe Jews are safe in Israel.
Right.
So the idea was to find a safe place. But now what are they? But now, no. I grew up in the 50s being told Nasser wants to drive us into the sea.
Yeah.
So what was the point? Now it's Iran wants to kill us, which isn't true. They've never Israel has attacked Iran in all kinds of ways: covert, proxy, cyber warfare, killing scientists. But supposedly it's surrounded by enemies. Well, what was the point then? Does that mean it was a mistake if they're surrounded by enemies? And here we are in 2021.
Yeah. So it's, one way that I've seen popular dissent against Israel suppressed is by sort of repeating 5 dangerous words, which is, it is all very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah.
Someone who might feel this way, look at the situation and, it is all very complicated, but we also can wrap our head around these things with a close enough investigation. And that's what I hope we're doing with this interview. And I think you've done with so much of your work. But, what would you say to someone who's just like, the historical wrongs can't be made right. We can't go back and make a non-state version of Zionism. Plus, there's violence on both sides. Nothing can be done.
Right.
I mean, what do you say to a person who tells you this?
Right. Well, first of all, I want to say that it may be complicated, but it's not as complicated, because it's not a religious battle going back to ancient times, because I don't think it's essentially a religious battle at all. It's really a property rights fight when you think about it. And it's interesting that some non-libertarian leftists who are sympathetic to the Palestinians don't realize how often they sound like advocates of John Locke. They don't seem to get it, right? They talk about Palestinians being kicked off land, deprived of their farms. That sounds like libertarian talk. And in no other context do the people I'm thinking of sound that way. So it's a much more recent thing, because you can really, you can look at the, say, 1947, 48. That's where the Nakba, that's what the Palestinians themselves talk about. And it's not religious. It's a matter of rights and property rights, and whether, you deserve to be treated like, every other citizen and inhabitant of that country. So that's what I mean when I say it's not complicated. So I think that's a way for people to remain agnostic, right? You can just sort of find an excuse in that to say, well, look, I'm not capable. This is old. This is religious. It's like the religious wars of the Middle Ages. I can't figure this out, so I'm just going to stand on the sideline. Yeah, there's violence on both sides, but let's be careful about that. the violence is so disproportionately on the Israeli side. It's not a joke.
Right.
They have the most modern military, thanks to the U.S. taxpayer, for one thing. What do they get? $3 billion a year, every year, plus additional appropriations now and then, all kinds of help.
Mm-hmm.
The Palestinians, what do the Palestinians have? They have rocks. They have a few rockets, which now are blocked by Iron Dome, which were never very capable anyway. They're not sophisticated. It's ridiculous. I mean, if you just look at the casualties every time the U.S. goes, the Israelis go into Gaza, it's absurd. Or when they crack down in the West Bank, where they're only, a little bit better off than the Gazans. I mean, Gaza's totally locked down, right? Israel controls everything, every access by land, by sea, the Mediterranean, and by air. So the import of goods are completely controlled. Lots of things are not allowed to go in there for fear they're going to have a dual use and maybe used, by militants. Well, how do you think people are going to act if they're locked up in a prison where half the population is under 18? The water is not good. What future do those people have? So that some people turn to militant means should be unsurprising. I'm not going to give my blessing to firing rockets at civilians,
but it's blowback.
But what would you expect? Sit down and talk to people,
right? But
the Hamas has always been an easy excuse. Oh, we can't talk to the Palestinians because of Hamas. Little do people know that the Israelis encouraged the development of Hamas in the 70s and 80s because it was supposed to be a religious rival to the secular PLO or Fatah, which was always a secular movement, right? They weren't fundamentalist Muslims or, crazy jihadis. Now, they did engage in outrageous suicide attacks that need to be condemned and stuff like that. But then they gave that up. Arafat accepted 22% of the land, famously, in 88. And I'm not going to claim him as any kind of hero. They engaged in terrible violence against civilians, non-combatants, and I'm never going to give my blessing to that. But it's not as complicated as people think, and we can sort it out. But if people there had the right spirit, and I think the Israelis need to acknowledge the grievance of the Palestinians, and I think that's just an important thing that has to be done. In a way, they didn't start this.
Yeah. Okay. So as far as solutions go, you've noted two things that can be done to cease the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people. One is that the U.S. government should cease all taxpayer aid to the Israeli government and cease impending Palestinian efforts to set up an independent country. And then two, the United States should withdraw from the Middle East and enter into a détente with Iran. So you've prefaced these solutions with doubtfulness as to whether or not they would actually happen. So beyond these policy proposals, which are obviously correct as far as I can tell, what should ordinary concerned people do to help find freedom from the Israeli state for Palestinian people?
Well, I'm against U.S. aid to any, and especially military aid, sending them cash and weapons. A lot of that is intended to come back to pay military contractors in the U.S. anyway. So it's one of those scams, right? We give them money and they'll spend some of it here, although they also have their own arms industry. But I don't think we should be giving aid. And I guess Israel only gets military aid these days. They no longer get sort of a general foreign aid, just cash. But they use it for atrocities, which is in violation of U.S. law anyway, right? There's supposed to be a rule that if we give arms or money for military weapons to a foreign government, we only do that so long as they're not going to use it for offensive purposes, something like that. Well, Israel uses their stuff for offensive purposes all the time, and they're holding people, they're subjugating people. So that ought to be done. On Iran, that's a good idea, even if there was not an Israeli issue. There's no reason why we should be in any kind of state of war, Cold War or whatever, with Iran. It's a myth that they've ever were building nuclear weapons. Gareth Porter's book, Manufactured Crisis, documents this very well. It's definitely worth reading. And I've tried to summarize some of it in a bunch of articles. So we should be on these neutral terms with Iran. We should not be looking for regime change in Iran. They're not planning to attack us, and they're certainly not planning to attack Israel, because Israel has nuclear weapons. Everybody knows it. It's the worst kept secret in the world. But they've had them since the 70s. They got materials from the U.S. I'm not saying directly from the U.S. government, but they had a lot of help from people, I guess, with connections in the U.S. And they have, by some estimates, a couple of hundred warheads, including on submarines. So Iran knows this. Iran's not going to attack Israel. It's perfectly safe from Iran. But meanwhile, Israel attacks Iran in all kinds of ways. So those things should be done. Whether they would change the Israeli calculus, they might if they had to absorb more of the cost of their military establishment. Mm-hmm. So if we don't pay them $3 billion a year, mm-hmm. who knows what they would have to do because of the new budget considerations. But we shouldn't be doing it, whether it's going to make a change there or not. The Palestinians have suffered, all these years, and they're people too. That's my message. They're people too. They deserve the same consideration. And our hearts should break when Gaza is attacked, or when kids have their bones broken in the West Bank.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's do one listener question, and then we can go to the actual end of our conversation here. Mm-hmm. So this listener asks, what's the simplest way for non-Jews to argue for Palestinian liberation without sounding anti-Semitic, especially to people who have the proclivity of associating pro-Palestinian sentiments with anti-Semitism?
Well, look, this is a problem. And again, unfortunately, I've had to say this too many times. I don't have a simple answer to that. No matter how many times and over how many years, Jewish anti-Zionists or anti-Zionists with a Jewish background who clearly don't, hate the Jewish religion or quote the Jewish people, point out that there's a big difference between, being anti-Israeli policy and even anti-Zionism in the sense that there ought to be a Jewish state, then that's not anti-Semitism. Plenty of people have an interest in pretending that distinction doesn't exist. And you still hear it lots of times. Students on campuses around the country who are either Palestinians themselves or descendants of Palestinians or sympathetic to Palestinians, and this goes for professors also in those same categories, who engage in activism to bring attention to the plight of the Palestinians, are routinely called anti-Semitic, and complaints have been made to the Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights, complaining that the school is allowing anti-Semitic activity. Who was a great offender of this? Someone who's considered a great free speech advocate, Barry Weiss. When she went to college, she constantly was bringing complaints to against Palestinian students for their activism, because they'd have a table set up with, laying out facts about how the Israeli government abuses Palestinian people. And the Trump Education Department was totally sympathetic to this. So I don't know how you convince people. We have to say it over and over again. And I understand the reticence that non-Jews would have to talk about this. But, Jews aren't exempt either, because the pro-Israeli people have conveniently come up with the idea of a self-hating Jew. You don't hear that so much anymore, but that used to be they couldn't call it, they felt they couldn't call a Jewish person an anti-Semite, so we'll just call him a self-hater, which, seems laughable, but I can understand why people remain silent, including Jews remain silent. I take no joy in writing about this or speaking about it because of my, own family heritage and the terrible things that befell Jews in Europe. I don't have any glee at all in writing about this. I wish the Palestinians weren't suffering, and so I felt compelled to write about it. But, I wish it wasn't there to have to write about.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we all appreciate you doing it. And speaking of, where can people go to follow you and your work? And where should folks go to learn more about, let's say, anti-Zionist Jewish authors or anything that we've discussed in this conversation today?
Well, my weekly output is at the Libertarian Institute, which is Well, if you just Google that, you'll find it. It's libertarianinst.org. The same stuff can be found on my own personal blog, which I've had for quite a few years, called Free Association. If you just put in sheldonrichman.com, you'll find it. I collected a lot of my articles going back some 30 years that I wrote about Israel, Palestine issue, the Institute put out, called Coming to Palestine. That was just out the last couple of years, so you can find that. There are other articles if you Google around. Some of them are at the C4SS site, which didn't make it into the book. I thought they were a little too tied to current events, so they just didn't strike me as right to put in the collection. I could have, just decided not to. People worth reading, I mentioned Shlomo Sand, who I think is a very interesting historian. You know, for 30 years or so, he taught European history at the Tel Aviv University. Still lives in Tel Aviv, I believe. And he wrote 3 books, which are very, very good, called The Invention of the Jewish People, The Invention of the Land of Israel. These are available on Amazon. And How I Stopped Being a Jew, which is his discussion of what does it mean, what's a secular Jew, which is very interesting. He's I take it he's somewhat left of center somehow. I don't think he's a libertarian, but he's also not a nationalize all industry and collectivize all land type either. And he's one, he thinks he still accepts, as far as I know, the two-state idea, but the 2 states he wants is a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. And he emphasizes not a Jewish state, an Israeli state, because there is a 70-year-old Israeli culture. You can't just wipe that out. That's what happens, right? People living together over time, you're going to get the emergence of a kind of its own culture. And so he's for peace and he's for people getting along and for secularism. But I don't think he's going to where a lot of people are heading, which is namely what they call one democratic state. That's rising. And if you read people like Gideon Levy, who's a columnist in the Israeli daily Haaretz, which is a major daily. If you look him up, you'll find English columns by him. And Ilan Pappé, who's, I believe, now in England, but he was an Israeli historian who's gotten books called Ethnic Cleansing in Palestine, and some very good works of history about the Nakba and other things. Noam Chomsky is worth reading on Israel and the Middle East. I don't agree with him on a lot of things like his economics, but I think he brings a very sober mind, and he's very judicious. I would look up the American Council for Judaism, which is that remnant of the Reform and anti-Zionist with Alan Brownfeld. So there's plenty to put in there. If you put in Jewish anti-Zionism, and I have some links in the various articles, so if you search for me and find my articles, look for links. But Google, if you would Google Jewish anti-Zionism, you're probably going to get some things. There's a biography of Elmer Berger, Rabbi Berger, out there called Renegade Rabbi. It's by Jack Ross. Renegade Rabbi, Maverick Rabbi. I forget the exact title, unfortunately. So, but if you go to Amazon, you'll find it.
All right. Okay, Sheldon, is there anything I forgot to ask you about that you'd like to touch on before we end the interview?
No, I think you were very complete. Apologize for a little bit of the rambling. You might have gotten more focused questions in there, but I hope what I said was relevant and helpful.
It was very helpful, Sheldon. It was great. Really appreciate you coming on.
Well, thanks.
This is going to be a great episode, so thank you so much for joining me.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. I like to talk about it now and then. I don't think I'd want to do it every day, but it's been a while since the last one, so thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Great.
Bye.